How you guys been so far? Yeah, cool. I have some of my favorite designers here. I'm a fan of all you guys individually, but as a group, this feels like the Avengers of design panel, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah.
I think I have to.
So some of you guys might not know them, so I figured maybe we can go really quickly. Say your name, your role, and maybe the weirdest thing you've ate recently.
Okay. Hi, my name is Cathy. I am a product designer at Instagram. Okay, hey. I also do a lot of work at Facebook at the Analog Research Lab. That's where we create a lot of our posters, and it's just like a lot of internal culture initiatives are being initiated there. And so I'll show you some of the work later on. But the weirdest thing I ate, not sure.
Did I make something up there?
I'll come back to that.
Howdy, I'm Dana Lawson. I'm the VP of Engineering at inVision. I'm the only non-designer up here. Oh, cool. I'm the one that y'all get mad at when I'm like, no, you can't do that. That's probably not going to happen. It's cool, though, but probably not going to happen. I'm that person. I have the beautiful opportunity of getting to work with designers at working in inVision, and I'm just super honored to be here, to be able to talk to y'all and be with this awesome panel. Weirdest thing I've eaten, I'm going to have to say 2 a.m. Jack in the Box tacos. It's pretty weird. Don't do it. They're gross.
I remember what I ate recently. Chili mangoes. Yeah, it's good, but it's like weird. Yeah.
Interesting. Was it a mango
It was like
with chili components, or was it a chili with mango?
It's like dried mango with chili. It was really good.
Interesting. Well, I'm Chikezie Ejiasi. I'm currently a senior product designer at Google. I work on VR on the Daydream team. Been there for about 6 months or so. It's interesting coming from 2D and designing for VR. Is a really interesting transition, getting to design in a 3D space. So I get to be an interior designer sometimes. It feels good. Weirdest thing I've eaten is either a tie between... So I grew up in the Midwest, for context. And it seemed everybody ate mayo and fries, which is like really odd, but it was delicious. So it was weird, but it was good. And then the most recent weird thing I've eaten, and I just can't get used to it, and everybody loves it, is kale. It's just like, I can't. It just feels really weird. It like tickles your mouth, and it's just really strange. Yeah, I can't do it.
Hi, everyone. So I'm also not a designer. My name is Cheryl Cheng. I'm one of the general partners at an early stage venture firm called Bluerun Ventures. In a previous life, I used to do new products for Clorox and Procter & Gamble. So not on the design side, but much more on the consumer insight side. And now, probably more reviled than you is me in my role as an investor, because we're very bottom line driven, right? And so at every meeting, we're asking, what are the results? What are the results? So let's see. The strangest thing I ate recently was the Mother's Day breakfast that my children cooked for me, and I still don't know what I ate. But it came. I didn't ask. I just ate it, and then I went back to bed. Yes, it came from the heart, though. So what can you do?
Well, my name is Jacinda Walker. I'm a graphic designer by trade, but a few years ago, chucked it all and quit my good government job with my corner office and a window and indoor heated parking. And I decided to go to graduate school. I got an offer from The Ohio State University. And I just finished doing my research work with looking at diversity and design disciplines. I also own and operate a design education business named Design Explore. We offer youth activities, consulting with clients, and we also have an amazing website that we're trying to build out. And I also have the opportunity of being the chair of AIGA's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force for the national level. So I work very closely with 72 chapters nationwide and 27,000 members. So that's kind of what I do. Oh, and the weirdest thing This one time I was in New Orleans, and I ate something called a gator kebab. It tastes like sausage.
Great. Awesome. Cool. So this panel is called Untapped Potential, and I figured we can get together and talk about the D word, right? Not that one, but diversity. So yeah, diversity. So some people might think that there's an archetype for the right designer or worker, right? And that person might look a certain way, they might act a certain way. So I'm curious, why is it important to challenge that archetype?
Stereotypes are never good. I mean, when as creatives, when we come up with personas and archetypes, we're really talking about stereotypes in a very covert, creative manner. We're really talking about these stereotypes. So what happens if what you perceive as happy really isn't my happy? So you, again, have used your bias in a manner that's going to influence the rest of us. So I understand we do it, and I understand why, but there's really some care there. I love the last presenter who talked about using, your superpowers for good. And so what are you going to do now that you know this?
Yeah, to kind of add on to that, I don't know where I saw it, back when I actually had cable. I saw this piece about there is this guy from Britain, and he would walk to people's houses, and he would convince them that he was like an interior designer or like some sort of like expert in something. And they believed him. They would just like go into their house and he'd make these recommendations. Then there'd be like this reveal that, oh, actually I'm not an interior designer or whatever. I'm just some random guy and you just like let me in your house. But there was this added perception of, because I have like a British accent, I'm like really good at like this like thing. I think there's really interesting kind of like reverse kind of directive there about if it was like me that walked up to your house, like would you believe me? Like would you let me in your house? So it's just interesting, like when we challenge or like when we present these commonplace archetypes, they can manifest in like very negative ways, especially like when random black people show up at your door. Like how do you treat that person, right? You don't expect them to be like an expert in design or like an expert in code. So I think it's really interesting to start challenging that stuff now. But I think you have to do it across multiple industries, including Hollywood, because they are one of the main reinforcers of those things.
So my industry is probably one of the least diverse industries in tech. And, we do what we can. But I think one of the reasons why diversity is important to me, both from a design perspective as well as just as an investor, is because human beings have natural biases and they draw from our past. It's not a good thing or a bad thing, they're just naturally there. And so when you see a problem or you see an opportunity, you see it through a different lens. And unless you have diversity on your team, be it designing a problem or a product for a problem or making a decision whether you're going to invest millions of dollars, you have to be able to approach it from multiple perspectives. And when you don't, you end up as a team collectively, because you're all individually sort of the same, from maybe the same stereotype, making the same decisions over and over again. And sometimes those are good, but oftentimes you'll also make the same mistakes over and over again. And over time, it can be very toxic. So to me, that's one of the things that I think is really important to avoid as much as possible. And to one of the speakers earlier, it's important at the decision-making level, not just from the creative level or everybody who's doing the work, but the people who get the final say, right? Is there diversity in thought at that point? And that's where I think we have a little bit of a chokehold right now. So,
yeah, no, that sounds great. Sounds almost obvious. So I'm curious, like what?
You would think.
Yeah, like how do we get here? Like what? If it makes so much sense in theory, in practice, why are we in an industry that is not diverse?
Oh, well, I've been doing this now almost 20 years. Believe it or not, I know I look like I'm 27. But I think it's fear. I think a lot of it's fear, and a person once said to me very recently, likes. It's this amazing principal engineer from Intel. She's been with them like 25 years. And she says, the reason is because you don't see people represented. You don't see people up here like this. You don't see conferences like there. When you were a kid, when I was a kid, growing up on the border of Texas and southeast New Mexico, you never heard about women in engineering. You know, there's like, you're staying at home making babies and like doing baby stuff. And obviously I have very high nurturing skills. And I think that, you know, I think there's a fear in it because when you don't have that commonality to connect, there's this fear that, well, you know, just like Chikezie was saying, it's like, you know, some rando showing up at your house, you're like, they can't do that. So by having this, it kind of breaks down those barriers and says, you know what, you can do what you want to do. And having people that represent you shows that if they're doing it too, then so can you. And so I think a big portion of it is just people are scared. They're scared of not being around people they're like. And the world is about not being around people you're like because we're shoved with this image of this is who you are, this is what you represent, this is how you're going to do it. And if you have any kind of variance in that, you're like, oh, I'm stuck in this little box of only doing this one particular thing, or I'm outcast and not given that opportunity. And I truly believe that that's been the reason for a long time is there hasn't been representation, but there's not been representation because there hasn't been a platform, and there hasn't been a platform because people are scared. But I don't know, what do you guys think?
And I also feel like, you know, in the past there hasn't been a lot of visibility. So like conferences like this never existed. I remember, you know, like I've been in this industry for about 15 years, just like, you know, like I see like white European guys like being represented in design publications when I was going to school, and that's all I know. Like, you know, designers should be a certain way, and then so like when I was first starting out, I was feeling like really not confident as a designer, and then also not being treated with a lot of respect, just as women, you know, like coming from like. That I was born in Taiwan. I don't speak, I didn't learn how to speak English until I got here. So language has always been something, you know, I feel really insecure about. Even now, I ask my wife to read my email for me sometimes, because even though like I'm getting really good at it, but there's something you always feel like, oh, I'm incompetent, or you're afraid to speak up. And then so I think slowly, I'm just so glad that, you know, we're being more visible, like have opportunity to kind of elevate conversation. And just get together and share our experiences. It's really important.
Jacinda, I know you have some historical context that maybe would be helpful to share.
Yeah, no. I do tons of context. I don't know, are we going to go through the slides?
Yeah.
Yes, great. So doing this type of research work means you have to really, really get deep down in history. So I'm about to really geek out. So I don't want you guys to get scared, okay? Don't be nervous, because I got some real shadiness to tell y'all. So I'm going to make sure that I stay on script, but I just want to tell y'all this. So during my research of diversity in design disciplines, I found that the lack of diversity unfolds with the beginning of John F. Kennedy's presidency. After years of segregation and investigations about racial inequalities, JFK, he begins conversations with many leaders and officials to get input and support for a bill about civil rights. Now, a lot of people try to ask me, and they say, well, lack of diversity in design, it started from slavery, right? No. Diversity in design, the lack of diversity in design did not come from slavery. The reason that JFK's request for civil rights is so important is because we never had that request from the top. There was never that request. It was always a request from, as we like to say nowadays in social justice work, community activism, grassroots. You know, these are code words from the bottom up. And so when JFK started doing this, he sent a ripple around the United States. I mean, the world was watching us. But on June 11th, in 1963, the University of Alabama was forced to desegregate. This was a big deal for JFK because he had been kind of tap dancing around the issue a little bit. He was afraid to do it. He didn't get great election numbers. People were concerned that if he was the one who brought it up, Are you going to get reelected? And so he was tap dancing around it. But when he had to literally call the National Guard down the University of Alabama and tell George Wallace, get the hell up out the way, he had the confidence to come and make this announcement. So he desegregated University of Alabama, like let's just say 1 o'clock. He was on the television at 8 p.m. that night telling people, this is what I'm about to do. He asked Congress to think about creating and looking into what he called a moral crisis. He announced that he was going to ask Congress to commit that it has fully made this country possible, that he wanted to be able to say in a bill legally that race had no right, had no position in the way we were operating in government. So after he makes this huge speech, people are falling out, people are nervous, and he took a lot of heat. He spends months going back and forth with the House and the Congress trying to get this bill passed. Finally, in October, the House passes the bill. Finally, he's assassinated 4 weeks later. It hurt. Now, after the death, okay. After the death of Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in. He spends the next 8 months with help from many leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Whitney Young to get Kennedy's bills passed. They want to maintain his legacy here, all right? But in doing so, he had to make a few concessions. Everybody knows what a concession is, right? Raise the hands, yes? A sacrifice. You got to give something up. He had to compromise. So the bill wasn't going to actually have sex in it. It was just going to say race. But he had to concede with religion, and he had to add sex. He had to add. So these are some types of things he did. Next slide. And in July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was signed. Now, after the signing, many thought that the hard part was over. But in reality, the hard part was just beginning, because many organizations and institutions began to silently oppose the new law with policies specifically targeting the folks who were just awarded their civil liberties. Now, one of the institutions and who had unfair policies and practices was the American Institute of Architects. And in 1968, Whitney Young addressed the AIA about their silence during this crisis and allowing this to continue to happen. And in all actuality, this is the first time we hear about the lack of diversity in design. So we've been talking about this and asking about this since 1968, and we still have not made it. Now, unfair policies and practices that result in differential access to goods, services, and opportunities of a society by race is called institutionalized racism. And we see this a lot in healthcare, housing, education, you name them. Next slide. Now, another big bite in the workforce when we talk about the history components of this is the amount of people incarcerated. You have to understand that over the last 40 years, the incarceration numbers have increased 300%. The privatization of prisons have literally taken a hit in our population. Data indicates that one out of every 3 black men, 1 out of every 6 Latino men, versus 1 out of every 17 white men are in prison right now. The United States imprisons 25% of the world's population. So we're only 5% of the entire world, but we imprison 25% of the entire world's population. Now, Michelle Alexander writes a lot about this in her new book called The New Jim Crow. Now, ramifications of the Civil Rights Act, institutionalized racism, and mass incarceration may have been seen throughout the design profession in the form of detrimental attitudes in education, discriminatory hiring practices, cultural insensitivities in advertising, and minimal diversity building initiatives. So these are the things a thesis and 4 years of research work will get you to know. So I know that was a lot. I know it was a lot, but you wanted the history.
Totally. No, that's great. I guess now that we know this, the question is like, what do we do, right? And at all levels, what do we do as employees, as CEOs, as designers who make products? Like, really, what can we do, and what's available for us to take action?
Absolutely. One of the things that we have to really think about, and this is something that we're working heavily with in AIGA, is that we're beginning to look at the design journey. Because if we continue to think the lack of diversity exists is one problem, we'll never solve it. What we have to understand and accept is that it's multiple problems along the journey. So depending on where you fall is the problem that you're having. So if you're in the beginning of your journey, it might be access and exposure. But if you're in the middle part, it might have something to do with opportunity. And if you're nearing the end, which hopefully you'll come back and help in the beginning, but if you're nearing the end, that's gonna really look like value. You know, that's where we start talking about these glass ceilings, we talk about management, we talk about who's making these types of decisions. So if we begin to think of it as a journey and problem solving along the journey, we may actually solve it.
Cathy, you've been involved with some semi-activism right through your work?
Yeah, so I want to talk to you guys about some of the work I've done recently and how it kind of relevant to working at Facebook too. So first I want to also just talk about like the importance of building company culture, because culture is a set of values that's core to everything we create. So it needs to reflect people within the company, their voice, and also the people that we're building product for. So it's really, really important. So that's one thing beyond doing product design work. You know, all the things you see later, it's all like time I put in on the weekends and late nights. It's something I feel really passionate about, because I remember, like, you know, just in my past experience, being at companies that didn't cultivate that kind of culture and made me feel really alienated. So I want people who work at Facebook and Instagram, like even beyond that, now being able to kind of like empower people and make them feel like comfortable and share their experience and just feel like, you know, they're accepted. So we you know, at Facebook we use posters. We love posters, and that's how we kind of like communicate. And I remember when I first joined the company, I met Ben Berry. He was the founder of the Analog Research Lab, and I was very fortunate I got to talk to him. He showed me around campus, and I was surprised. I was like, wow, anyone can just like put a poster on the wall. And he said, yeah, if you want to have democracy, you want to give people a voice, you can't just say, oh, someone can put an ugly art, like, no, you can't do it. Or like, your art is better than, you know, someone else's. And that's kind of the, you know, sort of like the risk you run into, but it's also the beauty of it. So that's the advice I give to everyone now. Like when they first start working there, it's like, you don't need permission to do anything. If you want to share your voice, just like put something on the wall, like even just like write a post and talk about it. And then so some of the things you'll see here, like I teach classes at the Analog Research Lab. I work with a lot of, we have these employee resource groups at Facebook that are Black at, Pride at, Women at. So I do a lot of diversity kind of like design work with them. And then so teaching people how to make their own posters and share their own message is very empowering. And so these are just some pictures that you see like I've done over the years working with different teams at Facebook. And we, yeah.
As we stay here in this company culture topic, I'm curious, like, I know, Chikezie, you have some thoughts to share here, and maybe then we can expand it beyond your company.
Yeah, I think there's obviously two things that are pretty obvious to us. Hire a diverse team and keep that team diverse. I think the question of how to hire that diverse team is obviously a pretty contested one. I think the answers that we know is, okay, like, it's a pipeline problem, like there just isn't enough talent. Like, one, that's false. The talent is there, we're just not finding it. But there's also some nuance to it a little bit, like where we're not doing a good job at educating young kids that these opportunities exist. For example, every year we do like a Take Your Kids to Work Day event at Google. Pretty typical, like all the Googlers bring in their kids. It's a lot of fun. And we do a workshop where we do like a 10x thinking workshop, and we ask them to imagine like, what does your school look like 50 years from now? And it's really interesting, like when the Googlers bring in their kids, they're thinking about a lot of ideas. They're doing like paper prototypes. They're imagining like, okay, I want to like take a teleporter and I want to like go visit like India, and I want to come back and like use that stuff and like bring it back home. And they're using some pretty grand things that we talk about. It's actually pretty fascinating to see like 9 and 10-year-olds use the same terminology. And it was interesting, like we branched out and we did that same workshop for kids at school districts like Oakland and Hayward. And it was really interesting to see how the ideas were the same, but the technology was different. It was more practical. It was just about books. It was just about having access to the same things that other kids had. So it's just interesting that the idea of being like a designer, the idea of being a developer just wasn't penetrating. So one, just inspiring kids today that these things exist is hugely important. And two, one thing that I don't really hear about the hiring process that I think is really important is having a conversation with your team to make sure that everybody there is comfortable with the team as being diverse. This sounds ridiculous. This sounds crazy, but you'll be surprised at how many people don't actually want to be part of a diverse team. They might not expose it right away, but they'll just, they will be the toxic part of your team if you don't resolve it. And the worst thing they can do is when you hire diverse talent, that person is going to take the blunt of all of that trauma. And then the second part of like, how do you like retain that person, right? I can only really speak to this in the context of a designer. I think a developer is definitely relevant. And I'm sure I love working with you. But one of the most important things is giving that designer a voice and an opportunity to grow. And I'm not just saying like, okay, give them like, all the special projects or give them all the projects that tackle like, diversity issues. I'm talking about giving them the opportunity to have a voice in the meeting without having to give them a voice. Give them an opportunity to speak up at the things that they're passionate about, not the things that you're passionate about them solving, right? So for example, one thing that I think is like really vital to our positions as designers is we tell a lot of like user journeys. We take our clients on like user journeys. I think that's beautiful. I think that we can put a client like in a user's shoes. We say, okay, this is Eric, where he's a 24-year-old. He's going through this product, and this is how this product is going to be better because it works for him. Right? As a black man, like as a designer, I get to actually customize like those stories based off of, like my own experience, and that stuff is like unique to clients because they're not seeing it from those angles. So I think like user journeys and actually using like diverse examples is actually a really powerful way to start designing for communities, because you start designing for communities, you start to launch design in these communities. And I think that's actually a beautiful thing. Because I actually really love the example that the Bevel product is actually doing. Bevel, if you don't know it, I'm kind of doing a product shout out right now. But they make grooming products for men, for black men. And I think it's like beautiful. You actually look at their about page, and it's like all black men. And it's like all black men and women. It's just amazing to see that they're able to like build a narrative like around that product, and they're able to attract all that talent. And that wasn't just because like, hey, we're a diverse team, like we want you to come here. They actually did it through the product. They used the product to like tell that story. And I thought that was beautiful. And I think there's a lot of teams that are obviously trying to do that, but I think once you have people that come from different backgrounds and they can influence the product that they're working on, I think that's a vital thing.
So I do agree that the problem that we're having with diversity and many things, it stems in education. Like my children who are really young, they're not always exposed to the things, and we're not going to see the manifestation of that for another 20 years. But what can we do today? One of the things that I found that's interesting is that when somebody graduates from college, you think they're grown up, that they're an adult, but they're not. They've actually just gone through a certain academic track that doesn't necessarily translate to their forever career. And I think that companies need to think about listening to what their employees are good at, even though that wasn't what they were hired for initially. So I mean, my parents were immigrants, and my parents still do not understand what I do. And you know, if you really kind of dig in, like my dad is a chemical engineer, you know, as all good immigrant Asian men are, because his English wasn't good, but you know, he was really good at math. And so that's how he could make a living in this country. My mom was actually much more creative, but she's the minority voice in our family from like social construct and everything. So I never really heard her voice all while I was growing up saying, go into marketing, go into advertising, I didn't hear it because everybody was so used to listening to dad. And I think the same thing happens in companies. You go in and maybe you start off as an engineer because that's what you studied in college, but maybe you have a passion and an insight. And I think it's part of the company's job after you've hired this pool of talented young people to listen and watch for what they're good at and then give them the confidence and the access and the skills to maybe change careers. And you don't hear that happen very often. You just hear people get disgruntled and then they leave and then they say, I'm just going to go start something new. When really at a place like Google or Facebook, like there's an opportunity to take a young engineer who's maybe not a great engineer and maybe make them a designer. But you have to make the design function approachable to somebody who didn't grow up in it.
You never want to make an engineer a designer, trust me. Every time I give them a prototype, they're like, what the hell are you doing? I'm like, buttons everywhere. I'll make a button for that button. And then I get yelled at. I don't know. I'm in a unique position because, you know, I am an executive. I influence. I have the opportunity to influence who you hire. And I think a big important part is my company is a unique one. You know, I don't want to sit here and be like, oh, inVision's the best, but it is. It really is. But, you know, we're a 100% distributed global company. And by nature, we have the opportunity that a lot of people don't by just hiring anywhere we want. And so my team right now, I have people on every continent except Antarctica. I'm waiting for one of those scientists to become a designer. They should probably become an engineer, though, trust me. But I think it gives you unique perspective. And the thing that motivates me is, you know, I have a seat at the table. Like, they put me at the, like, you know, being a lady executive, that's kind of unheard of. Like, down here in San Francisco, I ask around, I'm like, you VP? They're like, you are? I'm like, I am. They don't believe me at first, but I'm like, seriously. And I think by by finding a company that really cares about it, I mean, it's going to change, and I want more companies to care about it because you put people in those positions of leadership, they're going to bring in people that are underrepresented, and that's the first step. You know, trust the people and listen. I think you've all said it over and over. You have to listen. It's like grassroots doesn't work if nobody's listening at the top. You need to put those people at the top and actually force change, and then it's going to go all the way through. And by having events like this and bringing it to the table and taking that from that subconscious, because a lot of the times it is subconscious, or, you know, you hear that word unconscious bias. I call people out on it, you know, and I expect people to do the same for me. But it's about having, you know, a grown-up conversation about what makes, you know, everything better, because you know, to flip it over when building products, right? You know, that's what I do at the end of the day. I'm responsible to take your amazing ideas, tell you no, and then eventually do them. But there's this term called navel gazing. Has anybody heard that term, navel gazing? Navel gazing is basically when you're so busy just looking at yourself, you don't realize what's going on around you. And so it really loses perspective. And I think, you know, I have a unique position, at least where I'm at today, is by having a global team, we're building a product for everybody. And when you build a product for everybody, then everybody wants to come and be a part of that. And then everybody feels represented. It's kind of like what Chikezie was saying, like, until, you know, this amazing company really said, you know, what we're targeting, and then we're going to go for it, it would have been probably a bunch of navel gazers not looking at what they can actually accomplish and expand. And so I think, you know, really putting emphasis in that, you know, you're going to have some of the best things in the world come out. You know, you're not going to just have this one thing that works for this one person. You're going to have something that works for many. And it really changes your perspective on how you can build product and how you can design for. Because, you know, people aren't binary. I tell my engineers that every day. I'm like, if only we wore robots, it would make my life so much easier. Because then I could just program it away. But the reality is we're multifaceted, and there is no, you know, black or white. There's a a very wide spectrum of gray or whatever representation. And I think that it's my responsibility to ensure that we don't lose that perspective by participating and speaking up and listening. I think at the end of the day, listening, you know?
So we have an audience here full of designers and people that make products. And I'm curious, how can we then translate all this and actually influence our work? I love this example of some of the work you've done, Cathy, to actually bring your perspective into the product and influence it in a very tangible way. Curious if you can talk about how you can actually bring that into a product.
Yeah, I think just as like I was saying before, like depending on the problem that you're trying to solve, depending on the size of the project, take time, take weeks. Like convince. It's gonna be hard to convince like your clients, but take weeks to understand the problem, and don't put underrepresented people at the end of the process. And you have to like really start thinking about like who are we making this product for, and how can we expand that reach. And I think user journeys again is like one really powerful way, because you can do it with pictures, like really simply. This is a person from an affluent neighborhood. This is a person from a poor neighborhood. This is how they're going to experience this product. Have them side by side. Actually show this person is actually in the affluent neighborhood is actually going to be really happy with this product. This person in a poor neighborhood is actually going to have a really hard time with this product. And then you have to make that decision to say, yes, we are willing to accept that. Right. And I think that'll be much harder for you to do when you actually see that at scale. So I think that's actually one really powerful thing for designers. But I know it's hard. I think one of the biggest things, at least what I experienced, was, you're sitting in a meeting and everybody's coming up with ideas, and you actually bring an idea to the table. You think, oh, actually, I have my voice now. I'm here. I made it. Right? This is good. But then you bring up the idea, and they're just like looking at you like just a big stare, just like, I can't empathize with that problem. No, we're not going to do that. So those are one of the problems that I think that we face. That I brought it up. I had the bravery to bring it up, but I didn't have enough support from the people. And that goes back to the original problem of making sure that your team is actually capable of listening to people with different perspectives. So I think visually you can at least use those user journeys, put them side by side of, you know what, this is something that I'm familiar with, and I'm telling you that this is actually going to suck for these other people, right? But it depends on what you're working on. Yeah.
I think it's also, I can only speak from the perspective of, I see some of my startups, they're in this incredibly run as fast as possible mode. So they're trying to solve for problem A, and then they only solve problem A. When I used to work at Clorox and Procter & Gamble, and we would develop new products, we would go into people's homes. We would kind of see how they interacted with everything, even things that were unrelated to what I was trying to build, because it was important to understand the user holistically. And so when they would give you feedback like, oh, this is really hard to open, or this is really hard to close, we would sometimes dismiss them as oh, they're just a minority of people that it doesn't matter. But when you went in to somebody's home, you would realize, oh, these people are disabled, or they're really old, or anybody who's over 50 that has arthritis has a hard time. So there's all these things that you see, but you have to leave Silicon Valley. And I think that's something my startups have a really hard time with. They recruit user groups off Craigslist that are local, and they do all these things, and I'm always but that's not who you're only selling to. You're selling to all these different people, so you have to go visit them.
Yeah, sometimes I think where companies get caught up is definitely in the wanting to make sure everybody wants to be diverse. Because really, some people really aren't. But diversity has to be on the front end, and it has to be purposeful. It has to be purposeful. So we kind of can't just tap dance around it well, what do you think about having a woman on the team? No, you hire her ass, tell her work starts at 10, get here, guess what? She's the new person on the team. So I think sometimes when we tap dance around it, we miss it, and I feel like we've been tap dancing since 1968, I told y'all. So I don't think we have the luxury to continue to do that. We're in a minority-majority trend right now. So if you don't want to get your teams diverse, in a minute, that's all that's going to be left to hire.
Great. I think that's a great way to wrap it up. We're running out of short on time, but we could talk about this for hours. So if you guys want to keep talking about it, we'll be around after the rest of the speakers are done. But please give a round of applause to the great panelists.